Good morning, Sangha brothers and sisters. So, this we'll talk about. Last time I was talking about Bodhidharma. There's delightful faces on this book. And I think I forgot the exact wording of the topic. It's something like the first three transmissions of Zen, or something like that. So what I want to look at is starting with Bodhidharma, who for all practical purposes is the icon of Zen. You see, you could consider him the origins of Zen as we understand it in this lineage. Certainly he's one of the individuals that's listed on lineage charts that lead up to who we are in this practice. And there's this concept of dharma transmission, which is very central to the mythos of how we receive the teachings and the practices that we have. This text is one of the most important, the transmission of the lamp. It's expensive and hard to find. And it's one of the best reference books because most of the koans we have in the various koan collections derive much of their information from this text. And this text is one of the earliest, which pulls together various historical sources and puts it together into a narrative, including that part of the narrative of the Indian transmission, which appears to be mostly a Chinese invention. That is, we don't have sources in Sanskrit or other Indian languages to piece together those early transmissions in India, of which Bodhidharma then is the 28th and then brings it over to China to become the first. The interaction between Bodhidharma and his disciples constitutes a transmission of the Dharma as he received it through a lineage from Shakyamuni to himself, and then transmits it to those individuals who then leads to Hojo-san and various others in America today coming from Japan. So Bodhidharma wrote a little poem, or we have a poem which is attributed to Bodhidharma, which defines what this tradition is in some ways with respect to Dharma transmission. The poem goes as follows: a special transmission outside of Scripture, not dependent upon words and letters, directly pointing to the heart of being, seeing into one's own nature. So those are the words attributed to Bodhidharma with respect to transmission. There's a paradox in this, which could serve as a koan, if you like, which is that the transmission is no transmission, because nothing is given and nothing is received. But I suppose that's consistent with Hojo-san's teachings that this is good for nothing. And so there's a kind of a nothingness that is transmitted. Of course, nothingness in the Asian way of thinking about it is a little bit different than, say, Jean-Paul Sartre's being and nothing. There seems to be an entirely different genre of response to the concept of nothingness in the West from the East. So it becomes a little more difficult to translate this idea of nothingness. That is, the Dharma transmission is about nothingness. But it reveals itself to some extent when you look at the various stories of transmission. And so I want to enter into the discussion from passages in the transmission of the lamp related to Bodhidharma and Hugo, the first transmission that we have in China. And so as the story goes, Bodhidharma is at the Shaolin Temple. And Yuko goes there to receive teachings. He's a novice monk. And so at Shaolin, it is said that Bodhidharma spent 9 years just gazing at a wall. And they just called him the wall-gazing Brahmin, according to this. So Yuko goes there and he stands outside of the cave. This is the winter month, and so the snow starts accumulating. So we got the special effects outside, but it's not going to be anywhere near that. This is more like what you might get at Buffalo, New York, where you can measure in feet. Because the poem goes, and I don't remember where this poem comes from now. Who dares to follow such practices? Long ago, the second patriarch visited Shaolin, waiting for Bodhidharma to finish sitting. He stood in the garden in the deep snow. So the story goes, there he is, the snow is accumulating and it's up to his waist and so forth. And finally, Bodhidharma looks out and says, what do you want? Why are you standing out there in the snow? Here it says, Master Bodhidharma took pity upon him and asked, what are you seeking, standing in the snow for so long? And so he responds saying, please have mercy, open the gates of nectar, deliver the message that liberates sentient beings. Now here's one of our classical slap downs that we so often encounter in these koan stories, where Bodhidharma responds by saying, the supreme unequal spiritual way of Buddhas is accessible only after a vast eon of striving to overcome the impossible and to bear the unbearable. How could a man of small virtue, little wisdom, slight interest, and slow mind obtain the true vehicle? Striving for it would be in vain. I'm talking about a slapdown, like, oh man, you're just not qualified for this. You're just not the right person. Sorry, go away, go away. Isn't there a tradition in some of the monasteries in Japan that when a person goes there, there's a waiting room and they have to wait and they have to wait and they have to wait, and then at some point they throw them out and they have to come back and wait some more, wait some more? Is that a tradition? I've never encountered that. Here in America, they don't do that. I guess we're more humanistic. But of course, it's understood that that's the ritual. And there's some interesting stories I've encountered over. I think, again, I can't remember the source, but one should desire the dharma in a way that's comparable to if a person's hair is on fire, they're looking for a pool of water to dive into, or words of that effect. And then I remember another story where this young man goes to the abbot of a monastery and says, I want to become a monk. And so I remember a similar encounter when I was teaching at IUPUI, where this person knew I was a novice monk and said, I would like to become a monk. And after talking to him a little while, I figured out that what he really wanted was he didn't want to have to deal with the world. The world really sucks. It's too complex. He's kind of in an existential crisis about the whole thing. He just had a romantic notion of the peacefulness of being a monk in a monastery somewhere, and where he didn't have to deal with family and income tax and cars and rush hour and all that. I mean, that was sort of his motivation. Just drop out, get the hell out of the complexity of this world full of suffering and pain and all that. That's what he wanted. But anyway, in the story, the abbot takes him out on a boat. And when they're out in the middle of the lake, he grabs the young man and he throws him into the water and ducks him and holds him. And then he lets him come up for a quick breath of air and then ducks him again. And at some point, he finally just grabs him and brings him back in the boat. And the young man is all upset. What the hell are you doing, you crazy guy? You're trying to kill me? And the abbot says, when you want the dharma as badly as you wanted that breath of air, then you'll be ready. It seems like that's part of what's going on here. Although that sounds a little more Rinzai to me. You know, we prefer like just Shakantaza, you know, silent illumination, you know. Because there's a sort of a paradox in there. I mean, if desire is the source of suffering, then how is desiring to get out of desire going to do anything more, right? How do you work with that? I mean, how do you desire to get rid of desire when that itself is a desire? So it becomes kind of one of these strange feedback loops, which I guess you can just sit with as a koan, and when you figure out what the sound of one hand clapping might be, perhaps you'll figure out how you can desire to be without desire. Well, anyway, here the story gets rather weird, and I don't think historically accurate, because the second ancestor, to display his determined mind to receive the dharma, chops off his own arm and gives it as an offering. I almost wonder, you know, like some of the special effects on that movie Kill Bill, where blood is splurting everywhere, and here the guy's holding his arm out, and Bodhidharma's, oh my God, what did you just do? And they're going to have a casual conversation about the Dharma while this guy is splurting blood everywhere. So no, this is not historical, but you know, like so much, you know, whether it's you know, Bodhidharma, there's lots of really far out legends about him. You know, he crossed the river, surfing across the river with on a leaf. You know, we got that story. You know, it almost seems like he's one ups of Jesus walking on water. He's going to surf across it. And then there's the empty tomb. Hey, you know, there's another parallel between Christian mythology and Bodhidharma, because, you know, it's said that he died, he was poisoned, and they put him in his tomb, and then somebody reported having seen him wandering around the Himalayas carrying a sandal. And so what's up with that? So they went back to the tomb, and they opened the tomb, and there was no body in there, but there was a sandal. You know that story. So we have a death and resurrection motif here. You know, those who are into comparative mythology might find that rather interesting. Of course, my favorite is the eyelids. You know, I always think about that when we drink green tea. Well, that's the eyelids of Bodhidharma. He just ripped them off and threw them down because he got irritated because he fell asleep during meditation. I mean, who hasn't done that? You know, the most common mantra you hear in early morning retreats is people snoring. You know, it's always amazing that they can sleep and, you know, sit in posture like that. And of course, I know that there's been many times where I mean, you might dream about Satori. Well, anyway, so after that, let me see, where's the line? The Dharma seal. So Bodhidharma replies to this gesture of offering an arm. All Buddhas in search of the way have begun by ignoring their bodies for the sake of Dharma. Now you have cut off your arm in front of me. You have the right disposition. So Yuko replies by saying, may I hear about the Dharma seal? Now, this is an important line. The Dharma seal is not something which can be heard from another. Now, Dharma seal is sort of like Dharma transmission. So, you know, we go back to our poem here. A special transmission outside of Scripture, not dependent upon words and letters, directly pointing to the heart of being. Well, so words and letters. I cannot tell you what the Dharma is. If I did, you wouldn't be able to hear it from the words alone. It's the direct pointing. We'll look in a few seconds to the idea of non-dual, because, you know, language has the effect of creating a duality, because when I name something, I objectify it, it's now other, and I relate to it. So the Dharma seal is not something that you can receive in that way, not through words and letters. Now here's the more famous part of the koan. This is sort of like what triggers the satori. My mind is not yet at peace. Pray, set my mind to peace. Bodhidharma says, bring me your mind and show it to me, and I'll put it at peace. Pause. You know, this is not like having a conversation in a coffee shop. I mean, these are two monks who have been practicing meditation. So when he pauses, it could have been a very long pause as he now proceeds to try to satisfy himself as, well, where's my mind? I'm looking for my mind. This is very similar to David Hume's reflection upon, I've been looking for my mind, but all I find is this thought or that sensation, etc. I don't find a mind wherever I look. So we got something similar here. And he finally says, I have searched for it, but in the end, it is unobservable. Your mind has been set to peace, said Bodhidharma, and that's when we're supposed to have the satori experience. Does this constitute a dharma transmission? Well, in a sense, it sort of was the prerequisite of it, because there's a discussion later then where he receives a robe, and I assume it's the same robe, according to the legend, that eventually the sixth ancestor receives. There's no mention of a bowl, though, at least not in this text. But to get to that part of receiving the robe, which is symbolic of the transmission, it's not the transmission, it's just symbolic of the transmission. This is a well-known story where Bodhidharma is getting ready to take off back to India. This is just prior to when somebody tries to poison him again, and this time succeeds. So he has 4 disciples. I don't know what the status of the others are historically, what happened to them. But one of them was Dao Fu, and he's responding to the question by the teacher, demonstrate your understanding of the Dharma. So Dao Fu says, according to what I understand, the function of the Tao cannot be grasped through literal knowledge, nor is it apart from literal knowledge. This kind of reminds me of the discussion of that later phrase from Buddhism that painted cakes do not satisfy hunger. I don't remember who that was from. The guy that was sweeping and he hit a pedal and it hit the bamboo. Who was that, Ojo-san? Hyogen? Yes. So so he was an intellectual, a scholar, and he had lots and lots of books. He was very intellectual, and I guess he was confronted with a question from his teacher, something along the lines of, forget what you've read, forget everything that you've learned, and just show me genuinely, spontaneously, in this moment, your authentic understanding. And like many good scholars, he gets stumped. I know Joseph Campbell makes fun of PhDs like me because he says that when you ask a scholar a question in the academic world, they'll begin with clearing their throat, and they'll just kind of pause for a little while, and then finally they'll quote somebody. See, that's me. I can quote somebody. But you take away my books, all my pacifiers, and ask me to tell you something spontaneous out of my heart, I would struggle with that. That would be difficult. But Dogon had a different spin on that, because he wants to take a different argument. I mean, he's a bit of a scholar. He wrote lots of books. And then Hojo-san has translated a lot of them. So he's in this scholarly tradition. So Do painted cakes satisfy hunger? Well, Dogen takes a little bit of a different view. I mean, it's sort of dualistic to say that all that learning from text is totally irrelevant, but it's not completely irrelevant because it's just part of what goes on in life. Right? We need a certain amount of intellectual understanding, but intellectual understanding doesn't quite cut the cake, so to speak. So painted cakes can satisfy hunger. So when I read this one about Dao Fo saying, well, to grasp through literal knowledge, nor is it apart from literal knowledge. You can't grasp it through the books, but neither is it apart from what's in here. I mean, I'm reading you things in the book. Well, so now we go on to the next person, the nun. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Zhang Xin or something like that. You wouldn't know by chance, would you? Now that's one problem I have as an academic. I read all this stuff, and even though I studied Chinese, I think I'm mispronouncing half these names. And during our when we used to do those discussions over in the dorm before the pandemic, I was always just absolutely amazed at the stuff that I have to read from books. Hojo-san just rattle off the top of his head like he just did a moment ago. Well, anyway, what she said, or none, is it may be seen in oneness, but never in duality. So we have a tradition about relative and absolute, and the relative is, the dualistic world that I perceive through one mode or other, but there's always a subject object. There's always a duality in it. It's this and that, up and down, right and left, etc. So you don't really see it in the duality. It's there, you just don't see it. The whole business of the relationship between relative and absolute. But it's never in duality, it's in the oneness. That was her insight. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I skipped the first, the response from the master for Dao Fu, when he said, you have my skin, and so the nun, she gets the flesh. And then we come to the Dao Yu, and he has an answer, and this will be the bones. The four great elements, and I assume this means fire, water, earth, and air, that is the idea of what the world is made of according to the ancient worldview, both East and West in this case. So the four elements are originally empty. The five aggregates, skandhas, and they list them here, although I don't really agree with the translations: physical, form, sensation, perception, impulses, and thought. Do not exist. I'll say something about the five aggregates. We have that in our chant, Heart Sutra chant. The physical form, okay, that works. That's the body. That's one. The sensation, okay, that works. The idea of seeing, smelling, so forth. Perception, I would prefer to say cognition, but that's not a big point. I guess perception would work. It's impulses that I have a difficulty with. The Sanskrit word here is samskaras, and they don't really translate as impulse. In fact, I don't know how to translate that term very well. It's sort of like spiritual scar tissue of sorts. It's the karmic consequences that result in the way in which the mind is conditioned, so that we are basically conditioned to be a certain way by the circumstances of our birth and our society and everything else that comes together to create this complexity of psychic structure that makes up who we think we are. And when Buddhism discusses the doctrine of no self, they go through this. In other words, what we mean by self is somehow a synergy or a gestalt of these aggregates, and that not in any one of these is found the self. Now, Buddhism doesn't really say there is no self. It's just there is no self to be found within these aggregates. So the last one then being thought, well, I just think it's usually translated as consciousness, and I prefer that one, all the more so since Bodhidharma is deriving much of his thinking from the Yogacara school, which is also known as the mind-only school. So consciousness is a very important element in understanding the metaphysics implied here. Well, anyway, so we got skin, flesh, bones, but Huko, he gets the marrow, but he doesn't have anything to say. He just bows and remains standing at his seat. So you got my marrow. This is the true eye of Dharma. At the beginning of this text, the transmission of the lamp, it has a discussion about the 7 original Buddhas, which did not receive transmission because they did it all on their own. So the first transmission, according to this, is Mahakassapa, and the story of Buddha holding up the flower. And then Kassapa smiles, and there's supposed to be a transmission there. So that there's the idea that without words, it's beyond words. So many times the best way to answer a question about Dharma is not to use words. But I forgot which koan it is, but somebody puts like a glass of water there and said, what is this? And I said, well, it's a glass of water. No. That's just a word. The best way of answering what this is by the act. Or maybe just kick it over. Things like that. All right, so that's the transmission. He gets the robes. Now there's another interesting collection with an interesting title. So this I was reading from the Transmission of the Lamp, and this book contains the whole spectrum, as it were, the 5 schools of Buddhism, the 5 houses, I should say, the 5 houses of Buddhism, of which Soto and Rinzai are just 2 of those. So 3 are virtually extinct, except we still have the teachings from those, because there's always this interaction between the different schools throughout the history of Buddhism. There's also one that spins off of one of the early patriarchs, I think the 4th one, if I remember right. I think, what is it called? Ox herding school? And the history of that, it kind of fades out, but it still has some relevance to this platform sutra. And then there's the Northern school, which is also covered in this book. But for the most part, Zen is derived from either Rinzai or Soto. And then this book, The Transmission of the Light, just focuses on those individuals within our lineage. Written by Keisan, who is one of the early teachers of Zen in Japan within our lineage. So it has a chapter for each person in our lineage. So there it is. So here's our lineage chart from the 6th ancestor to Dogon. So in many temples we chant this. And this book pretty well follows that outline, except it also has the first 6 listed. So there's something in particular I wanted, there it is. So I'm quoting from this text. The seal of truth of the Buddha is not gotten from another. Actually, we read something similar to that right there. So here we go again with the idea that dharma transmission is no transmission. Nothing is received that you don't already have. Nothing is given. So it's more like you recognize it, and then your teacher recognizes that you recognize it. Of course, in the modern sense, we have an added element to this, which is sort of certification to be a competent teacher in this tradition. So that's something we've added to it. It doesn't seem like in the ancient world that they were all that interested in how competent you are in being able to transmit. It's sort of like, if you understand it, then you can work with it, figure it out. And I guess, over the generations, we figure out a system. And so now we also have dharma transmission as a way of recognizing that the person has a competency in the forms and patterns of teaching this. And if you receive it, then you have an obligation to pass it on somehow. So Hojo-san has, he tells me, 13 Dharma successors. I know Mizumi has 12. I always thought that it would be interesting to have the Last Supper of Da Vinci with Mizumi as Christ and his other disciples as scattered in there. Which one would be Judas? I don't know. So the seal of the truth of the Buddha is not gotten from another. But then I want to move on to the next ancestor, which is chapter 31 in this book. And the teaching here, actually, let me go back to the transmission of the lamp, because this has a little more detail in it, if I can find it real quick. Well, I'm going to do it on memory. So Saigon, he's a lay person. He's not even a monk at this time. When he encounters the second ancestor, and he basically is suffering from some kind of illness. His body is all crippled with arthritis or something like that. I can really identify with this because after I finished graduate school, I wind up getting something called Still's disease. And it's like, that's why I'm in a chair now. I got artificial hips and artificial knees, and I was on a regimen of anti-inflammatories to cope with this. And it was like I was eating more and more of these pharmaceuticals, and it wasn't doing enough. And I was just in a lot of pain. And I already had some prior experience with Zazen. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just go into an intense meditation practice to resolve this issue with my pain. And it does work, because one of the things you do in Zen, letting go of the hand of thought, is when a thought or sensation or whatever arises, you acknowledge it and let it go. And so, in effect, the pain. Normally you say, "Oh God, I'm in so much pain." Well, flip that around, and rather than saying I am in pain, because I is a kind of a mental construct, it's empty. It's just something I sustain in my mind, moment by moment, this idea of I, of self, and then I attach that I, that self, to whatever feeling, sensation, and the thought. So I think this thought, I have this feeling. Well, you could flip it around and say, there is that thought, there is that feeling, and just drop I. And also drop the narrative. We have a way of creating a narrative. Well, let me tell you my life story. I was traumatized by being born, and I really didn't want to, and here I am, and now the next thing happens is I get hungry, and then I get cold, and God, life sucks, and this is why I'm so neurotic now, and et cetera and so forth. I can give you the narrative. And so in talk therapy, you do a lot of that. Psychoanalysis, you just talk through whatever your issues are. And well, in Buddhism, that's very different than psychoanalysis, because here we drop the narrative. Just drop the narrative and be with the energy in the moment in a non-dual way. So you're not analyzing it, you're just being with it. You're being with it, and in that way, at least the way it worked out for me in the 2 years I was at the Los Angeles Zen Center, is I was sitting with a lot of pain. But I was able to sit with the pain in a non-judgmental way, so that all of a sudden I was able to kind of cope with it more and then go on to other things. So in the encounter with Hoku and Seigan, we have a situation where the person says, you know, I'm in a lot of pain. Confess to me my sin. Now this is an interesting cosmology of the ancient world. That is, if you're sick, it's because you behaved badly somehow. You know, it's a karmic situation. You're getting your karma. I mean, this is not modern medicine. This is sort of like it's your fault if you're suffering. So probe whatever the sin is. And I mean, sin is an English word. I don't know what is being translated from the Chinese or Japanese. But there's the idea of confessing the sin. So the second ancestor does something similar to Bodhidharma. He says, well, bring me your sin. You know, bring it out and show it to me, and we can resolve it then. And once again, he probes. And I looked everywhere, and I just can't find it. It's not under the table. It's not under the rug. It's not up in the attic. I've looked everywhere. I just can't find where this sin. So there, you've confessed it. You're done. Now dedicate yourself to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I don't know if that's the first mention of these three, but it's one of the earliest. That the three that are important to what constitutes the Buddhist community. And we can go into an entire talk about that, but I want to go in a different direction from here. That is the discussion of the teachings of Seigan in respect to his contribution is this poem of faith in mind. In fact, the opening line, I don't even have to look at it, the opening line, because I just work with it like a mantra. And so the opening line of the poem is, the great way is not difficult for he who has no preference. When love and hate are both absent, the 10,000 things are as they are of a single essence. Make the slightest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. Now, if you understand that, you got it. I mean, what we have in this poem is perhaps one of the most profound, condensed statement of the Zen tradition in a way that is really very much a synthesis of Taoism with Buddhism. Now, the historical context of the transmission of Buddhism into China is that the people who are taking notice were the intellectuals, the scholars, the Confucians, the Taoists. Indeed, our robes are really on the model of the Confucian, these long robe things here. That's a Chinese kind of robe. If you look at what other traditions, you know, like the Tibetan, the Theravada, and so forth, they don't have these long robes. This is very Chinese. So there is a synthesis going on between the thinking of Taoism and Buddhism, and translating Sanskrit into Chinese. You know, it's not like translating Sanskrit into English, two Indo-European languages, because there's an alphabetic script, so you just find the English equivalency of the Sanskrit word and you can spell it out. And so everyone knows how to spell karma in English, and maybe you wouldn't even recognize it in Sanskrit, but it'd be pronounced the same. We don't have that luxury when we're translating from Sanskrit into Chinese, because you got the ideogram, the characters. And so you have to try to find something which has equivalent meaning and maybe more or less sound. So that creates something of a problem. So the scholars who translated, and in these early years, most of the monasteries, that's what they were doing. They were translating texts. Indeed, there was a supernatural attribute given to these texts, that they're supposed to have magical properties. I remember when I was staying with the Dalai Lama's monastery in India, I was hanging out with these monks that were writing these little mantras on little pieces of paper. and they would accumulate like a whole bunch of it, and then they stuff it inside the statues. It has sort of empowered the statue to have the wisdom that is entailed by the mantras that were written and stuck inside the statues. So there's the idea that Tibetan Buddhism is sometimes referred to as mantra Buddhism because they put a lot of emphasis on mantras, on sounds, and the use of sound in meditation. We're into the silent illumination, so we don't do so much with mantra, do we? But other schools of Buddhism do. And so that's basically what all these monks were doing, or many of them, and they were actually hundreds of other people besides Bodhidharma from India, and most of them were coming in to help the Confucian scholars who were converted to Buddhism to translate the text, all for the magical properties of the salvation that is entailed thereof by having these words then chanted. I have a friend of mine who the Flower Ornament Sutra. It's a big, thick thing, and every time I try to read it, it's so redundant. It just goes over and over and says, no, don't just read it passively. Chant it, verbalize it, because that's the way it was done back then. The monks were not just sitting around the library reading this stuff. They were in a hall together chanting it, and that's the way this stuff was transmitted. It was designed to be chanted. It's a poem of sorts. And it has as much to do with the sounds of the words as it does the meaning of the words. Well, anyway, I think I'll go through some of the, how are we on time?
Oh, you can go on.
How much on there?
5-10 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right, then I'll give a summary with some portions of this point. I know in a previous Dharma talk I read the whole thing, and I'm not going to do that this time. Because we don't have to. The opening lines, the great way is not difficult for he who has no preference. I see, Link tells a story about this. Link Rose is the abbot of the Indianapolis Zen Center, and I've done a number of retreats with them over the years. They're in more in Linji, where we work with koans more than we do here. But Link was telling me that, and his wife is also a teacher in the Zen community. In fact, she's in charge of the quantum school. And so the story goes that Link was reading this, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preference. And then the wife comes along and says, what would you like for dinner? Whatever. I have no preference. You can't function that way, really. Try being without preference. Do you prefer being without preference? It does set up a tension in that way. So when love and hate are both absent, now love and hate are never going to be completely absent, not as long as you're a sentient being inside of a physical body, experiencing the various things. When you're cold, you want to be warm. When you're hungry, you want food. There's no way you can be completely absent of this. So what's being talked about here? It's sort of like, all right, there is the preference. I am hungry. But right now I'm sitting, so I'm going to let go of that hungerness. It's not like that hungerness goes away. It's still there. It's just that's what I'm letting go of because I'm resting in that space, which is non-dual in that moment. And then that's basically my pain control then. Rather than identifying with the pain is there and I would prefer it not to be there, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm just going to notice that phenomena and then rest in a place which is non-dual. Everything becomes clear and undisguised, make the slightest distinction, however, in heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. So, if you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinion for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is a disease of the mind. Remember the 3 poisons. Wanting, not wanting, and then I guess the ignorance, which is sort of the driver, because the ignorance is thinking that who I think I am is who I am, And who I am is defined by liking and disliking. I mean, we talk to a child, you know, and we ask questions like, oh, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite color? And things like that. I mean, that's how we build our egos, right? We build our egos according to liking and disliking. And if you really want to know the person and their identity, you just find out all the things they like and all the things they dislike, and you tally it all up, and that becomes the ego. That becomes who they are. Well, all that is a disease of the mind. Dukkha, that's what dukkha is, liking and disliking. I mean, if there was neither liking nor disliking, there wouldn't be suffering. Of course, there wouldn't be existence as we know it in our sociological context and psychological context, because that's the whole structure of who we think we are. When the deep meaning of these things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. I'm skipping a part and coming down here. The more you talk and think about it, the further you wander from the truth. Stop talking and thinking, and there's nothing that you will not be able to know. Well, can you really do that? I mean, maybe Hojo-san, because he's so advanced, right? But I've never sat down for Zazen without having 10,000 thoughts float through my mind. I mean, I can keep letting go of them. As soon as I let go of them, another thought pops in. And then maybe I'll go through a few seconds in which there's sort of that emptiness there. And then some thought comes on. Oh, look, you achieved it. It's there. You got it. Which becomes a thought. Oh, well. So how do you do that? How do you let go of talking and thinking? Do not seek for the truth, only cease to cherish opinions. Just cease to cherish opinions. Because if you're talking about the truth, you're taking a point of view. So how do you exist without a point of view? When no discriminating thought arises, the old mind ceases to exist. When thoughts vanish, objects vanish. The thinking subject vanishes. And when the mind vanishes, objects vanish. So things are objects because of the subject, mind. The mind, subject, is such because of things, object. Understand the relativity of these two and the basic reality, the unity of emptiness. In this emptiness, the two are indistinguishable, and each contains in itself the whole world. If you do not discriminate between coarse and fine, you will not be tempted to prejudice in opinion. So this idea that, people talk about that which is objective. Well, there may be externality to my personified, individuated consciousness. But objects are objects because I perceive them as such. And in Indra's net, in which everything is interconnected with everything else, there is no outside to speak of, because it's inclusive of everything. So maybe I can't eat for you. However, there's still a intimate interconnectedness. I think it was one of the lines from Dogon, or maybe someone else, that enlightenment is intimacy with all things. Did Dogon say that?
I don't remember.
You don't remember? No. Well, I think I saw something which attributed that to him, but since he wrote so many books, it's not like studying Lao Tzu. You'll just have one book and you go through that a few times, and then I got it. I'm quite sure I've not exhausted everything that Dogon has written. Have you? Yeah, you have. Right. So, if you wish to move in the one way, do not dislike even the world of senses and ideas. Indeed, to accept them fully is identical to enlightenment. Now, that's an interesting line. I always like that one. Because in some ways, in my early days of learning Zazen, I was trying to get rid of the world of senses and ideas. Now, I always liked the playfulness of Alan Watts when he deals with Zen, because he's being a bit of intellectual here. And say, well, look, we got tea ceremonies, art and Zen in the art of tea, Zen in the art of archery, the martial arts and all that, flower arrangements and so forth. Well, why can't I have Zen and the art of thinking? Why can't I have? Alan Watts wrote a really fun essay about V.T. Suzuki, and I love the title. It's The Mindless Scholar. So Professor Suzuki was this mindless scholar, and he had on the one hand this experience and knowledge of Zen, and on the other hand, he's still reading and translating and things like that. So he's sort of a mindless scholar. That was Alan Watts's portrait of V.T. Suzuki, and that was sort of my role model for a while, being a mindless scholar. I don't think I've really achieved it, but maybe. Anyway, as I said, I don't want to read the whole thing, so I'm just going to go now to the last line in the poem, the last part of it. Words. The way is beyond language, for in it there is no yesterday, no tomorrow, and no today. So words create, as it were, the dualistic mind, and so it's the quieting of the mind that produces the satori of insight, of non-dual, that is one with it all, including everything that your mind does. So yes, words in some way do not truly represent reality, but words are still part of reality. Any discussion? Anybody have words?
Anything from anybody in this room? And then we'll go to the gallery. Any questions, comments? Sawyer.
So I think kind of early on in your talk, you mentioned a time when you were at IUPUI and a student came up to you and knew you were a novice monk and wanted to, or had an idea that he wanted to do that too, because he wanted to escape the busyness and the complexity and the responsibilities of the world. And I think you said that in the story, someone asking for that kind of thing, the teacher dumped the guy underwater, but you didn't say what you did to the student. What was your response when he was sort of talking to you about becoming a monk, or his idea of it?
Well, I'm not, that was like 15 years ago or so, and actually I think I just encouraged him to go find a community to go sit with, and I think that's when, that was before Link was here, and we had this little office space where we were doing Zen retreats, and actually I think I just sent him there to learn Zazen. But sometimes the motivation doesn't matter as much as what you do with it. And what he did with it, I don't know, because I'm not sure what happened to him. He took a few of my classes, including one on Buddhism. And I always try to cover elements of Zen meditation in the classes. And sometimes I bring in guest speakers. In fact, 2 of them right in here, because I had you as a guest speaker, and Hojo-san as a guest speaker. And then you came along a few times. But you're always so quiet. So you must be the wisest one here. You're just so quiet. I think we should have you do a dharma talk, and we'll just give you a flower. So I don't know where he is today, but maybe he's a monk.
Well, that's a more humane response. Tell him to go to a community rather than dump them underwater.
Yeah, well, I
Maybe
mean,
that's-
it's a story, and sometimes you can't take these stories seriously, you know. I mean, I guess that's sort of like tough love. I mean, but you know, the metaphor of it, what your hair is on fire, right? So the urgency of getting out of the burning house or whatever it is, that is, in some approaches to the Dharma, the urgency is the motivating factor for the practice. I don't think it's necessarily the case, but for many it is. I mean, if there were no dukkha, would there be Zen? I mean, in many ways, Buddhism is a response to the fact that people do feel this discontent with life and struggle with it. Maybe that's just true of religion more generally, looking for something to bring us into equanimity and peace of mind, anything, you know. I don't know if that addresses your concerns or questions, but do you identify with that? Well, we can go boating if you like. We could reenact that if you really want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Just bring your bathing suit.
to get dunked by Ritoku,
It's sort of like baptism, right?
that would be quite a unique experience, dunked by Ritoku. Thank you.
Anyone else in the room have a question, comment? Any comments from the gallery?
So thank you for the talk. I liked the point early on about the seeming paradox of trying to look at desire, but maybe privileging or looking for students who were motivated to seek out the Dharma as if their hair were on fire, or looking for breath. And I wonder if that could be a useful tool, especially maybe early in practice. But I would imagine that at some point it's important to let go of that strong desire.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And actually, I think, at least in the Japanese Rinzai, it's sort of like you push yourself to the point of exhaustion, and then when you just can't push yourself anymore, you kind of let go, and then you have a satori experience. It seems like some of these koans are like hitting your head up against a brick wall, and it feels good when you stop. But you don't stop until you stop. So what motivates the question? Is your hair on fire?
No, not necessarily, but no, I think like for me, it's just wondering, like, when you see these kind of proposed as models, you know, what's the larger utility of holding up those kinds of examples? And I assume it's not that, you know, we just want to realign our desire to turn into an obsession with pursuing the Dharma, but that must be some kind of useful, if temporary, technique. So for me, it's just thinking about, you know, what might you expect, how that motivation might shift. And so, yeah, I like the comparison to koan practice, where hitting your head against a seemingly impenetrable wall might be, in some ways, like a means to get to a point of exhaustion.
Yeah, I see your point. But I think, you know, the metaphor about the Dharma is like a boat that you take across, and once you're across, you don't pick it up with the boat and carry it. So, yeah, those might be tools for beginning a practice. But they're also very Hinayana in the classical sense of the word. I think in Mahayana, being more aware of the suffering of others and pledging yourself to alleviate the suffering of others, that gets you out of your own head a lot. Once you see that, hey, you're not alone, there's a lot of other suffering in the world, and so you dedicate yourself to saving all sentient beings, that it's the other people's hair on fire that you're going to run with a bucket maybe, or something like that. So whatever gets you out of your egocentricity sufficiently enough to become more sensitive to the interconnectedness you have with all beings is more of the Mahayana path. And I think that would be an alternative to being overly concerned with your own hair, if that makes
Thank
sense.
you. Oh yeah, no, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody else from the gallery? Any more questions or comments? Anybody else here in the room? Shall we wrap up? All right.
We're in your hands.
Thank you, Ritoku.